The coins made a dull, heavy sound as they dropped into his weathered palm, each one catching the morning light like it had something to say. We stood in the open space between my wagon and the lodge poles, the autumn wind stirring the dust at our feet. Beside him, the young woman didn't flinch, her gaze fixed on me with a steadiness that made it clear she wasn't here by choice. Her hands were empty, but there was a weight in the way she carried herself, as if she'd walked a long trail to reach this moment. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and dry grass, and somewhere in the distance a horse stamped against the picket line. I had the feeling that whatever path lay ahead for us had just shifted underfoot. Before I tell you what came of that meeting, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if you've ever found yourself staring at a choice that could turn your whole life, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the rest. My name's Jacob Carver, and I've run cattle in the high country of Wyoming for near on 15 years. I came west after the war, trading the crowded streets of St. Louis for open sky and land that would only give back what you were willing to sweat for. My father thought I was a fool for walking away from his freight business, and my mother feared she'd never see me alive again. Out here, you learn to be your own carpenter, blacksmith, and cook, because there's no neighbor close enough to lend a hand without a day's ride. I built my house from logs. I cut myself chinked with clay, and the corrals from poles hauled in behind a mule. Life on the ranch wasn't soft, but it was honest. I kept to the Sabbath when the work allowed, put by every penny I could, and never turned away a traveler in need. Folks in town lived by a different measure. They talked in banknotes and freight schedules, speculated on land the way a gambler plays cards. The railroad men were the worst for it, offering smooth words while they mapped out how to take what you had for the price of a handshake and a paper full of promises. I'd lived 4 winters alone by the time Elijah Whitfield approached me. He was a proud man, his authority worn into him like the lines in his face. But there was something in his eyes that day, the look of someone carrying more than his share. His daughter Sierra stood behind him, not a step back, not a step forward. She was 19 with the stillness of a deer that knows it's being watched, and the defiance of someone who has already said no once and meant it. Elijah's words came slow, deliberate. She had refused to wed Caleb Strongbow, a warrior whose name carried weight in more ways than one. The refusal had stirred trouble between their bands. He was offering me an arrangement she would keep my house, tend the cooking, and in return, have a place apart from the match she'd been promised into. I looked from father to daughter, saw the space between them, full of things unsaid, and weighed the 50 silver dollars in my mind as much as in my hand. By the time we set out for my place, the sky was turning that pale gold you only get in September, and the wind had the bite of early frost. Sierra sat beside me on the wagon seat, her back straight, her eyes on the horizon. We hadn't spoken 10 words between us when the trail bent toward the river, and I spotted a lone rider in the distance, coming fast. I eased the reins in my hands, not yet sure whether to slow the team or brace for what might be riding our way. The rider's shape came clear as the distance closed the afternoon light, catching the glint of a rifle laid across his saddle. My hands tightened on the reins, slowing the team without thinking. Sierra glanced my way, her braid shifting over her shoulder, but she said nothing. Dust trailed behind his horse in a low haze until he reined in a few yards from the wagon. It was Elijah's cousin, Daniel Whitfield, a man I'd seen once at a trading post near the reservation. His voice carried easily in the open air. "Caleb Strongbow's been in a mood since she turned him down," he said, nodding toward Sierra. "You might see trouble sooner than you think." The words settled heavy between us. I told him we'd be heading straight on without stopping in town. Daniel gave a short nod, glanced again at Sierra, and wheeled his horse back the way he'd come, the sound of his hoofbeats fading into the wind. The road west wound through rolling hills, patched with gold and rust, where the aspens had given up their summer green. The river we crossed ran low but fast, its banks lined with willows that whispered against the current. Sierra sat straight beside me, her hands folded in her lap, eyes on the horizon. The only sound between us for a time was the steady creak of the wagon and the rhythm of the team's hooves on hard-packed dirt. When the ridge opened to a stretch of open plain, I asked her why she'd refused Strongbow. She turned her head, then studying me as if weighing whether the truth was worth telling. "He has 3 wives already," she said, voice measured. "Each bears his anger in scars you can see and in ways you cannot." The air seemed sharper in my lungs hearing it. I asked if her father knew. She nodded once. He knew. But his band needs what Strongbow controls. My happiness is not the first concern. The light shifted as clouds drifted in from the west, throwing patches of shadow over the land. She looked ahead again before speaking. "I would not trade my spirit for their comfort, even if it means leaving all I have known." Her words held no tremor, no hint of regret. I thought of my own walk away from St. Louis, leaving a roof and steady income for land that didn't care whether I survived on it. We reached the ranch as the sun dropped behind the far hills. The house stood solid against the wind, its log walls catching the last light. I helped her down from the wagon, the boards of the porch creaking under our boots. Inside, I showed her the rooms, from the main room, with its stone hearth, to the smaller spare bedroom that would be hers. The air smelled faintly of pine from the fresh split kindling stacked by the hearth. Over supper, we spoke of what work lay ahead. She would keep the house see to cooking, tend to lighter chores, and help with records when needed. In return, I would provide for her needs and see that she had the choice to leave, if ever she wished. When she looked at me and said plainly, "You will not touch me without my consent," I told her she had my word. Something in her eyes shifted at that, a fraction less guarded. The days began to find their rhythm. She gathered herbs from the meadow to season our meals, mended worn shirts with neat stitches, and opened the shutters each morning to let the light in. In the evenings, we sometimes sat on the porch, the sound of her flute carrying out over the pasture. The cattle grazed farther out this time of year, and the air was full of the scent of dry grass and sage. As weeks passed, her questions turned to the running of the ranch. She learned the accounts quickly, catching small mistakes I'd overlooked, and suggested changes that saved time and coin. I began to see her influence in quiet ways, a new set of curtains in the kitchen water, carried to a patch of ground near the stream for a small garden come spring. One evening she asked about the church in town. "Your God lives in a house," she said when I told her about it. "Our spirits live in the wind and the water." The fire popped in the hearth as she spoke, the shadows moving on the walls. I told her maybe it was the same thing said in 2 ways. She shook her head slightly. "Your people fence the land to serve them. We serve the land so it will keep us." Her words stayed with me long after the lamps were out. When the first snow came, it fell heavy and fast, turning the corrals and rooflines white overnight. The cold pressed in from all sides, the wind singing through the chinks in the barn boards. Sierra seemed to settle into the season easily, working by lamplight in the evenings, tending to whatever small hurts the stock or the dogs picked up. Mid-January brought the worst of it. I was breaking ice at the creek when one of the younger cows slipped through, and in the rush to pull her free, I twisted my back hard. By the time we reached the house, I could hardly stand. Sierra eased me into the bed and set to work without a fuss. She brewed a poultice that eased the worst of the pain, kept the fire stoked, and brought me food when I could not fetch it myself. For 3 days she was there each time I opened my eyes, mending by the fire or reading by the lamplight. The storm outside kept the windows frosted and the world small. The only sound was the wind and the quiet rustle of her moving about the room. On the 3rd night, the pain had eased enough that I could think clearly again. I asked her why she was doing all this. She looked up from her stitching. "Because you would do the same?" I started to ask how she could be sure, but she spoke first. I've seen how you treat your animals, how you have treated me. Actions tell more than words." The fire had burned down low, the coals glowing deep red. I felt the words leave my mouth before I'd planned them. "I think I'm falling in love with you." She set the mending aside and met my eyes. "I think I am with you," she said. "But I must know I am more to you than work in your house. My spirit, my choice, they matter." I told her they did that. I saw her as a partner, not a possession. Her hand found mine, her grip firm and warm in the quiet room. Outside, the wind began to shift, carrying the sound of branches breaking under the weight of snow. Somewhere in that change was the sense that the trail ahead had turned, and with it the shape of the days to come. The days after that night carried a different weight. My back mended slow, so Sierra took on more of the chores without a word. She hauled water from the pump in the yard, her boots crunching over the packed snow, and kept the fire built high enough to chase off the morning chill. When the weather eased, she spread quilts in the weak sun on the porch rail, the smell of wood smoke drifting through the open door. I worked what I could manage, sorting ledgers at the table and oiling tack in the barn when the wind wasn't sharp enough to cut through my coat. By late February, the drifts began to melt back from the fence lines, leaving the ground soggy underfoot. We set to clearing branches that had come down in the storm, stacking them by the shed for cutting later. Sierra moved with purpose, her skirt hemmed dark, with mud hair tucked beneath a scarf against the breeze. In the evenings, she read by lamplight, pausing now and then to ask about a word or a place she'd found on the page. I told her what I knew, and she listened, without rushing me, her fingers resting lightly on the open book. Spring came early that year, the grass greening in the lower pasture before we'd finished mending the north fence. We planted a small kitchen garden in the plot. She'd marked the previous autumn rows of beans and onions set beside the herbs she favored. The stream still ran cold from the snowmelt, but the banks had softened, and the meadow beyond was dotted with wildflowers. The cattle ranged farther each day, their hides shining in the longer light. Sierra walked the edge of the pasture, with me noting where the grass grew thin and where we might hold back the herd to let it recover. One Sunday she asked to ride with me into town. The wagon rattled over the ruts as we made our way down the main street past the mercantile, the blacksmith, and the clapboard church. A few heads turned as we passed, some nodding and greeting, others watching longer than courtesy required. At the store, she chose bolts of fabric in muted blues and grays thread and a small tin of tea. The shopkeeper, Mr. Latham, greeted her politely, though his eyes lingered a moment before he turned to wrap the goods. We loaded the purchases into the wagon bed, the paper packages rustling against each other with each bump in the road home. That afternoon, clouds rolled in from the west, dark and low. The air smelled of rain before the first drops fell. We moved the horses into the main barn, securing the doors against the wind. Inside, the air was warmer, close with the scent of hay and leather. Sierra checked each stall, running her hands along withers and flanks, speaking low to the stock as the rain drummed against the roof. When the storm passed near dusk, the air felt scrubbed clean, and the creek ran higher, carrying twigs and leaves along its faster current. Life settled into a steady pattern. We shared the work without keeping strict count, each taking on what the other could not. There was a quiet ease in the way we moved through the days, the kind that comes only when trust has taken root. Yet beneath it, I knew the past was never so far behind that it couldn't catch up. Sometimes, when the wind carried sound from the ridge, I saw her pause, her gaze fixed on the distance, as if expecting someone to appear. It was on one such evening in late April that the first sign came. We were closing the shutters against the cool when I caught the flicker of movement at the far edge of the pasture. A small group of riders was making their way along the tree line, their shapes dark against the fading light. They didn't approach, only lingered long enough to be noticed before turning back toward the hills. Sierra stood beside me on the porch, her arms folded against the chill. She didn't speak, and I didn't ask. The moment passed, but the air between us carried its own kind of stillness. The next morning we found fresh hoof prints by the lower fence. They weren't from our herd, the shoes were narrower, the spacing longer. We walked the fence line together, noting where the prints crossed the damp ground and vanished into the thicket beyond. Sierra crouched, touching the churned soil, then straightened without a word. I tightened the wire where it had loosened and marked the place in my mind. Work didn't stop. The season pushed on with planting branding and the first calf born to the spring grass. We rode out to check the herd, the hills bright with lupine and arrowleaf balsam root. In the evenings, we took supper by the open windows, the smell of rain or cut hay drifting in depending on the day. Still, I found myself watching the horizon, more often scanning for dust where there shouldn't be any. One warm evening, as we sat on the porch, the sun throwing long shadows across the yard, Sierra set her flute aside and leaned forward. "If trouble comes," she said, "we meet it together." I nodded once, the boards creaking under my boots as I shifted. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and the sound seemed to carry farther than it should. The days ahead held work that couldn't wait. But the ease we'd built now had an edge to it, as if we both knew the trail was leading us towards something neither of us could yet name. By early May, the grass in the upper pasture was thick and green, the kind of growth that promised a strong season if we managed it right. Sierra and I moved the herd slowly, letting each section rest before we brought them back around. The days were long, the sun warm on our backs, but the evenings still carried enough cool to keep a jacket close at hand. The smell of lilac drifted from the bushes by the barn, and the air had that easy quiet that comes between spring storms. It was during one of those evenings that the wind shifted and brought with it the faint thud of hoofbeats. I was on the porch, oiling a bridle while Sierra checked the chickens. She straightened, head turned toward the sound, and I set the leather aside. Over the rise came two riders, both strangers to me, their mounts lathered from the climb. They slowed at the yard's edge, dust settling around them. The taller of the two introduced himself as Amos Dillard, a rancher from 10 miles north, and said they'd seen movement in the draws that didn't look like hunting parties. "Could be someone taking an interest in what's not theirs," he said, his eyes cutting toward the corrals. Sierra stood just behind me, her hands resting on the porch rail. I thanked him for the warning, and after a brief exchange about the lay of the land between our places, the riders tipped their hats and moved on. When the sound of their horses faded, Sierra stepped down into the yard, scanning the direction they'd come from, before heading back to the coop. There was no fear in her face, but the quiet between us that night felt heavier than usual. The next day, we made a slow circuit of the property. We found no sign of anyone near the north fence, but at the far end of the creek pasture, a length of wire hung loose, where it had been secure before. I tightened it, the metal cold under my gloves, despite the sun overhead. Sierra kept watch, her gaze moving between the open field and the line of cottonwoods along the water. As the weeks turned, so did the work. Calving picked up pace, and we spent hours each day checking the herd. Sierra rode alongside me, her mare steady, even when we had to turn a stubborn heifer back toward the others. In the evenings, she worked in the garden, while I saw to the tack, the smell of tilled earth mixing with the scent of oiled leather. We spoke less about the riders or the loosened fence, but neither of us forgot. By mid-June, the heat settled in. The hills turned from green to gold, and the dust rose behind the herd as they moved. One afternoon, while hauling water to the smaller trough, Sierra paused and shaded her eyes toward the ridge. A single figure on horseback stood silhouetted against the sky, unmoving. She didn't speak, just handed me the bucket and walked back toward the house. When I turned again, the rider was gone. Later that week, I rode into town for supplies. The main street was busy with freighters and wagons from outlying homesteads. At the mercantile, Mr. Latham leaned over the counter and asked if I'd had any trouble with stock going missing. I told him no, and he nodded slowly. saying a couple of smaller outfits west of here had lost a few head without a trace. His tone made it clear he thought the trouble might be traveling. The sun was low when I reached the ranch that evening. Sierra met me at the gate saying she'd seen tracks again near the creek bend, not fresh, but recent enough to stir unease. We walked down there together the next morning. The ground showed the imprint of 2 shod horses, the pattern distinct in the damp soil near the water. They led in and out at a narrow gap in the brush, a place easy to miss if you didn't know the land. We cleared the trail, dragging fallen limbs into the gap and tightening the nearby wire. It wasn't enough to stop a determined man, but it would slow him. As we worked, Sierra's expression stayed fixed, her hands steady. She said nothing of fear, only that she would keep watch in the days ahead. The work of summer didn't pause for caution. We cut hay in the lower field, stacking it under canvas in the barn's north bay. The smell of it filled the air, sweet and sharp. Evenings found us on the porch, again, the horizon painted with the last light, the sound of crickets carrying across the yard. Yet in that calm, I still found myself listening past the familiar sounds for anything out of place. Toward the end of the month, just as the heat began to break, a lone horse appeared at the far end of the drive. The rider was still too far to make out, but his approach was steady, dust rising behind him in the soft evening light. I set down the pail I'd been carrying, wiped my hands on my trousers, and stepped to the edge of the porch. Sierra joined me there, her eyes fixed on the figure drawing closer. Whatever business he had, we'd soon hear it. The rider came on slow but steady, the dust curling behind his horse in the evening light. As he drew close, I saw the lines in his face, sun-cut and deep, and the long dark hair tied back at his neck. He reined in at the gate, sitting easy in the saddle, his hand resting near the hilt of a knife at his belt. "I'm Caleb Strongbow," he said, his voice flat. "You have someone here who was promised to me." Sierra stood on the porch behind me, her skirt brushing the boards, eyes fixed on him without a flicker. I stepped down into the yard, the dirt dry beneath my boots, and told him plain that everyone on this place was here, by their own choosing. His gaze shifted past me toward her. "Your father took my gifts. Your word means nothing if you think you can hide here." Sierra moved to the top step, her hands at her sides. "I will not be your wife," she said, each word clear. "I am not yours to take." The air between us tightened, the sound of the wind in the cottonwoods, the only thing moving. Before the moment could turn, another set of hoofbeats came from the trees. Chief Elijah Whitfield rode into view with 4 men from his band, their horses moving at an easy walk. The chief's eyes took in the scene without hurry. "Daughter," he said, as he dismounted, "you look well?" Sierra nodded once. "I am well," she answered, "and happier than I have ever been." The chief looked at me then. "And you?" His voice held no challenge, only weight. I told him I respected her, that she was my equal in this life we'd built. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Elijah turned to Strongbow. "The woman has chosen. There is nothing more to discuss." Strongbow's jaw worked, but he said nothing. He swung his horse around sharply, the others following in his wake, and the sound of them faded down the trail. Elijah stayed only a short while longer, speaking quietly with Sierra near the corral. I kept back, letting their words be theirs alone. When they were done, he mounted and left with his men, the fading light catching the silver in his hair. Sierra and I stood watching until the trees swallowed them from view. In the days that followed, the ranch settled back into its rhythm, but the feel of that standoff lingered. We kept to our work, mending harness, clearing weeds from the garden, moving the herd to the east pasture, where the grass was still deep. Yet every so often, I'd see Sierra glance toward the ridge, as if measuring the distance to trouble. One afternoon, we rode to check the north fence. The sky was high and clear, the air warm with the scent of sun-baked earth. A hawk wheeled overhead, its shadow crossing the ground ahead of us. Sierra rode in silence, her back straight, her eyes scanning the far hills. At the fence line, all was secure, the wire taut, and the posts firm in the ground. Still, we rode the length of it before turning back. That evening, we shared a quiet supper. The light through the windows had the golden hue of late summer. Laying long across the table, Sierra cleared the dishes while I stepped onto the porch. The yard was still, the air cooling fast. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called, and the sound carried far in the night. I knew the peace we'd found could hold, but only if we guarded it. The weeks after Strongbow's departure passed without word. But I didn't take that as an end to the matter. Sierra worked beside me as if nothing had changed. Yet I noticed how her eyes lingered longer on the ridge lines and tree breaks. We kept the herd moving between pastures, watching the grass and water carefully. By late summer, the heat began to give way to cooler mornings, the air sharper when the sun first touched the hills. One morning, as I was checking the south corral, a rider appeared from the direction of town. It was Amos Dillard, the same rancher who'd warned me once before. He tied off his bay and stepped down, dust settling around his boots. "Saw a pair of men asking after your place," he said, voice low. One of them had the look of Strongbow's band, but I didn't catch his name. He told me they'd been at the smithy asking about stock and trails. I thanked him, and we stood a while in the yard, the wind carrying the smell of cut hay from the barn. When Amos rode out, Sierra came from the garden, her hand still damp from the water bucket. I told her what he'd said. She didn't answer right away, just set the bucket down on the porch and looked toward the distant hills. "We should be ready," she said finally. That afternoon, we checked every stretch of fence and made sure the tack was sound. I moved a rifle to the rack just inside the front door, out of sight from the yard, but within easy reach. The days shortened, the angle of the light changing across the pastures. We began bringing the cattle in closer at night, bedding them in the nearer fields where they were easier to keep an eye on. Sierra took to walking the yard at first light, her shawl wrapped tight against the chill. She never said what she was looking for, and I didn't press her. Mid-September brought a storm that soaked the ground and swelled the creek. The morning after, I found fresh prints in the mud along the far bank. They weren't ours. The shoes were lighter, the tread sharp. I followed them as far as the cottonwoods before they cut back into the brush. When I returned to the house, Sierra was on the porch steps, her flute in her lap. I told her about the tracks. She only nodded, but I saw the way her fingers tightened on the wood. Work carried on because it had to. We stacked the last of the hay, mended the roof over the lean-to, and gathered what the garden had left before the frost could take it. In the evenings, we sat by the fire, the sound of the wind moving through the eaves. Some nights, Sierra played the notes low and steady, carrying out into the dark as if to mark our place on the land. It was near the end of the month when the next sign came. We were in the barn oiling harness when the dogs began barking from the yard. I stepped out to see two riders at the gate. They didn't cross in, only sat their horses watching. One was a man I didn't know, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat too heavy for the weather. The other was younger, his eyes moving over the house and outbuildings. After a long moment, they turned and rode off without a word. Sierra stood in the barn doorway, the light falling across her face. "They'll be back," she said. I knew she was right. That night, we agreed to keep the stock in close and to ride the fence each day until the matter was settled one way or another. The moon was bright, casting long shadows over the yard, and for a while neither of us spoke. The quiet had a weight to it, the kind that comes before something breaks. The two riders returned on a cold morning in early October. This time they came into the yard, their horses blowing steam in the crisp air. I stepped out from the barn with a halter in hand, setting it aside as they dismounted. The tall one, the same man I'd seen before, spoke first. "We've come for her," he said, his voice carrying enough to reach the porch. Sierra stepped out the door, closing quietly behind her. "You're not welcome here," I told him, keeping my tone even. His eyes narrowed. "You think you can keep what was promised?" Before I could answer, the younger man shifted his weight, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver. The movement was slow, deliberate, meant to be seen. From the edge of the yard came the sound of more horses. Chief Elijah Whitfield rode in with 6 of his men, their mounts moving in a tight line. He dismounted without hurry, his boots sounding heavy on the packed dirt. "The matter is settled," he said to the tall man. "My daughter stays where she chooses." The tall man glanced between us, the set of his jaw hardening. Sierra moved down the steps until she stood beside me. "I choose to stay here," she said, her voice steady. The yard was quiet except for the shifting of hooves and the wind in the cottonwoods. The tall man gave a short, sharp breath through his nose, then swung back into the saddle. "This isn't over," he muttered, turning his horse toward the trail. The younger one followed his gaze, lingering on Sierra before they both rode out of sight. Elijah stayed behind, walking the length of the yard with me. He asked about the fences, the stock, the creek. When we stopped near the porch, he looked at Sierra. "Your life is your own," he said, "but know that I stand by it." He and his men mounted and left their figures growing small against the pale sky. The rest of the day passed in the rhythm of chores, mending a gate latch, moving hay into the barn, checking the water troughs before evening. But the sense of something building hung in the air. When the sun dropped, I sat on the porch steps with a rifle across my knees. Sierra joined me, her shawl pulled tight. We didn't speak much, just listened to the night settle in. 2 days later, Amos Dillard stopped by with word that strangers had been camping near the old stage road, not far from the turnoff to our place. He said they kept to themselves but watched anyone who passed. I thanked him and saw him off, then found Sierra in the garden. We should be ready for anything, I told her. She nodded once, her hands still in the dirt around the last of the carrots. That evening we brought the herd in close and closed the main gate. The lamps in the house burned later than usual, their light spilling onto the yard. Somewhere out past the ridge, a coyote called the sound thin in the cooling air. I had the feeling the next knock on our door wouldn't be a friendly one. It was just past dawn when the knock came firm, but not hurried. I opened the door to find Chief Elijah Whitfield standing there, the morning light catching the frost in his beard. Behind him were 2 of his men, their horses waiting in the yard. He stepped inside without ceremony, glancing toward Sierra, who had come in from the kitchen, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "They won't trouble you again," Elijah said, his voice steady. "I spoke to the council. Strongbow's claim is finished, and any man who stirs it again will answer to me." The air in the room seemed to ease with those words, like a rope cut loose. Sierra met his eyes, nodded once, and thanked him. No more was said on the matter. After he left, we moved through the day's work as usual. There were fence rails to set in the west pasture, and the garden needed clearing before the ground froze. The chores felt different now, lighter somehow. The sun broke through the high clouds by midday, warming the yard and sending the last of the morning frost dripping from the eaves. In the weeks that followed, the season turned in earnest. The cattle came in close to winter shelter, and we stacked the last cords of wood by the porch. Sierra played her flute in the evenings, the notes carrying over the still land, weaving into the quiet, like they belonged to it. The sound reminded me that what we'd built here wasn't just survival. It was a home. Looking back, I knew the trouble had tested more than our will to hold the ranch. It had proved the worth of the bond we'd forged, one built on trust work shared without tally, and the certainty that neither of us stood alone. On the frontier, land can be bought, fences can be built, but a true partnership that has to be chosen every day. Winter came on with its long nights and deep cold, but the house stayed warm, the stock healthy. And in the stillness between storms, I often found myself on the porch beside Sierra, watching the land stretch out under a sky full of stars. Whatever came next, we'd meet it the same way we always had, side by side. If you've ever stood your ground for the life you wanted, you know the kind of peace that follows. I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if this story spoke to you, I hope you'll join me for the next one.